That night, in the great room of the seaside estate in Marblehead, 40 of the most powerful people in Boston raised their glasses as Rafael Santoro stood and announced that Priscilla Hale would soon become part of this family. Priscilla smiled, stepped forward, placed her hand on the shoulder of the 19-year-old girl, standing silently beside her, and promised in front of everyone that she would care for Nadia as her own sister. The whole room applauded. Only one person did not. Nadia took a step back, looked up at her brother, and said in a voice clear enough for the last table to hear, "No, I want Mari." Raphael went still. He lowered his voice and told his sister that this was not the place for that. But the girl did not back down. "I can't pretend, Raphael." Whispers began to move from table to table. In the corner of the room, the nurse in the gray uniform quietly set down her tray, and every eye in the house began turning toward her. Priscilla kept the smile on her face, but the fingers wearing his ring drew tight. She said that Nadia's brother had never asked her to choose, that she couldn't understand why the girl would say such a thing in front of everyone. And Nadia answered an answer that stopped the glass halfway to Raphael's mouth, that held the entire room silent for the longest 3 seconds of the night. "Because you're only kind to me when Raphael is watching. Mari is kind to me on the nights when nobody is." Raphael looked at his sister, then at the woman he was about to marry, then at the nurse standing motionless in the corner. Priscilla said quickly that the girl was frightened, that she believed someone was going to separate her from her brother. But Nadia shook her head, and she spoke a name that no one in that room believed she could possibly know. If this story touches your heart, leave a like and share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories we tell next. And stay with us until the end, because that night was only the beginning. 3 years before that night, Rafael Santoro was only 31 years old, and the house in Marblehead was still filled with human voices. He had taken over everything his father left behind only 9 months earlier. And in those 9 months he had learned that power wasn't like a cloak draped across a man's shoulders. It was more like a wire pulled tight, with another person stepping onto it every day to test how much weight it could bear. That Thursday afternoon, he changed his schedule. Over the phone, he gave Tobias Mercer 2 short sentences. The meeting was pushed back to 6 o'clock that evening. He would remain at the office on Hanover Street until then. He didn't explain anything more. Tobias didn't ask, because in this house, people didn't ask questions when the answers wouldn't change anything. Teresa Santoro walked into the study at 2 o'clock that afternoon with the keys to her own car in her hand, then placed them on her son's desk, with the expression of a mother who had made up her mind long before she opened her mouth. Her car was in the garage for repairs. She needed to take Nadia to try on a dress for the school's end-of-year performance, and she didn't want to ride in the chauffeur's car because Nadia liked the back seat of her brother's car, the seat the girl still called the king's seat. Raphael slid his own keys across the desk toward her. He didn't look up. He was reading a contract, and he believed he would see his mother again at dinner, just as he had seen her at dinner every day for all 31 years of his life. She paused in the doorway, turned back, and told him not to skip meals anymore, that a man who ate standing up in the kitchen would sooner or later begin living like a man who ate standing up in the kitchen. He laughed and said, "Yes, Mother," and those were the last words he ever spoke to her. At 4:10, his phone vibrated. It wasn't Tobias. It was a number he hadn't saved, and the voice on the other end called him by the name only hospital employees ever used, his full name, the name printed on official papers. Everything else from that afternoon would later remain in his memory only as scattered fragments. The hard slam of a car door, the overhead lights in the hospital corridor, that white light without shadows, the kind of light that made every face look the same, the sound of his shoes against the tile floor, growing faster, then breaking into a run. A corridor longer than any corridor he had ever walked before, and at the far end of it, Tobias Mercer was waiting, his hands hanging empty at his sides, no file in his grip, no phone, nothing at all. 47 years old, a man who had worked for Raphael's father for 18 years, and had never once allowed anyone to see him at a loss. Yet that afternoon he couldn't find a single sentence with which to begin. Raphael stopped 3 steps away from him. There was a closed door to the left, and Raphael looked at that door before he looked at Tobias, because some part of him already understood, and it was trying to stretch the last few seconds of his old life for as long as it could. Tobias said her name. Then he added one more sentence, very softly, that the girl was still alive. Raphael didn't sit down. He stood in that corridor for 4 hours with his back against the wall, and every time someone in a white coat passed by, He lifted his head like an animal waiting for news. No one came to tell him anything else during those 4 hours. It was close to midnight when Tobias finally handed him a sheet of paper folded in half. The first report contained only 2 sentences. The first said that the other car hadn't been there by chance, that it had been parked on that street corner since morning. The second said that it had waited there for 4 hours for one specific vehicle, and that vehicle was registered in the name of Rafael Santoro. He read those 2 sentences 3 times. Then he folded the paper again along the exact same crease, carefully, as though making that fold straight was the only thing left in the world that was still under his control. Tobias asked whether he wanted to sit down. Rafael shook his head. He looked toward the far end of the corridor, where the door was still closed, and he said the words he would carry with him for the next 3 years, a sentence so quiet that Tobias had to step closer to hear it. It was looking for me. It got the wrong person. Tobias didn't answer. There was no answer to a sentence like that, and he was wise enough not to search for one. Nadia lived. She was 16 years old then, and for the first 3 days she lay still, staring at the ceiling, not crying, not asking questions, not wanting anything. On the 4th day, they allowed her to go home. Raphael took his sister into her room, placed their mother's blue shawl on the pillow, and sat down on the edge of the bed to wait. In his mind, he had already prepared every answer to every question a younger sister might ask. Where is Mother? Why? Was it someone's fault? He sat there until morning, and Nadia didn't ask a single question. She picked up the shawl, pulled it tightly against her chest, then turned her face toward the wall. For the next 4 months, inside the great house in Marblehead, no one heard the girl's voice even once. The doctors used long words to name what was happening to her, and Raphael memorized every one of them, writing them down in a small notebook he kept inside the drawer of his desk. But none of those words explained the one thing he truly wanted to know: how to bring someone back from a place they had retreated into on their own. Every night, on his way to his own room, he stopped outside his sister's door. Some nights he knocked. Some nights he only stood there, with his hand resting on the doorknob, then walked away. And through all the 3 years that followed, not once did he dare say to Nadia the words he had spoken to Tobias in that hospital corridor that night. 8 months before that night in the great living room, the house in Marblehead had learned how to live with silence. People walked more softly on the stairs. They closed doors with both hands instead of one. And inside that house, there was one thing that was always moving: Teresa Santoro's blue shawl. It appeared on the front steps in the morning, on the armchair beside the window at noon, draped over the stair rail in the afternoon, because Nadia carried it wherever she went, and wherever she stopped, the shawl stopped with her. She was 19 years old now, nearly as tall as her brother. But when she sat on the floor of the second-floor hallway, with the shawl wrapped around her hands and colored pencils arranged in an arc in front of her, the housemaids passing by still lowered their voices as though they were walking past a sleeping child. That morning, Rosalind Santoro arrived earlier than usual. 68 years old, she walked into her grandson's house without announcing herself, sat down in the chair she had been sitting in for 30 years, and waited until the coffee had been poured before she spoke. She said she had been thinking a great deal. She said one nurse wasn't enough, that they should hire 2 more to divide the shifts, that the hours of in-home therapy should be increased from 2 sessions to 4 each week, and that she had already consulted a doctor in Brookline whom she trusted. She said all of it in the voice of a woman accustomed to having her words carried out. Raphael listened to everything, without interrupting once. Then he set down his coffee cup and said he appreciated it, and that he would review the matter. Rosalind looked at her grandson for a long time. She said he wasn't listening to her. Raphael replied that he was listening, but listening didn't always mean agreeing. She told him that this entire house was revolving around one person, that an entire family was shrinking until it fit inside a single hallway on the 2nd floor. And Raphael said the words very quietly, so quietly that she had to lean closer to hear them, that his sister wasn't a problem that needed to be rearranged. Rosalind fell silent. She was a woman who had buried her husband, had buried her daughter-in-law, and hadn't cried in front of anyone either time. She stood, walked toward the door, then stopped, and added one final sentence: that love without discipline was only another way of abandoning someone. Raphael didn't answer. He waited until the sound of her car had completely disappeared beyond the gates, before going upstairs, and there, sitting on the 3rd step from the bottom, was the 4th nurse. She already had her coat on. Her bag rested at her feet. Raphael understood immediately what was happening, because he had seen that exact posture 3 times in 11 months. The first nurse had lasted 5 weeks and left after Nadia knocked over the medication tray for the 4th time, and before leaving she had said that she hadn't been trained to care for an adult who behaved like a child. The second lasted 9 days. The third lasted 3 weeks and left at 2 o'clock in the morning, leaving behind a 2-page letter filled with professional terms that, once stripped down, meant only one thing. "I'm sorry, I can't do this." The 4th had been there nearly 2 months, longer than any of the other 3, and Raphael had begun allowing himself to hope. He asked whether it was about the money. She shook her head. He asked whether anyone in the house had said something to her. She shook her head again. He asked why, then, and he asked it in the voice everyone who worked for him knew was the most dangerous one. Very soft, very calm. The woman stood, picked up her bag, and said that for the past 2 months she had done everything she had been taught to do, had given the medication on time, had kept every record, had talked enough, had been patient enough. But that morning, when she sat down beside Nadia, Nadia stood up and moved somewhere else. And suddenly she understood that in 2 months, not once had she managed to sit quietly beside that girl for more than 3 minutes without trying to fill the silence with a question. Then she spoke one final sentence before walking down the stairs. "She doesn't need a nurse, Mr. Santoro. She needs someone who isn't afraid to sit in silence." Raphael remained standing on that step for a long time after the front door closed. Then he walked down the 2nd-floor hallway and stopped outside his sister's room. The door was slightly open. Nadia sat on the floor with her back toward the doorway, the blue shawl draped across her shoulders, and in front of her lay a blank sheet of paper with nothing drawn on it yet. He stood there with one hand resting against the doorframe, and he knew exactly what he should do: step inside, sit down beside her, and say nothing at all. He had known that for 3 years. In the end, he tapped twice, lightly, against the doorframe. Nadia didn't turn around, but she shifted the shawl to one side, leaving an empty space on the floor just wide enough for one person. Raphael looked at that space. Then the phone in his pocket vibrated, and he did what he had been doing for 3 years. He told his sister he would come back later, and he went downstairs. That afternoon, he called Tobias Mercer and told him to find someone new. Tobias asked where he should look this time. Raphael was silent for a moment, then said not to look in the best hospitals anymore. Find someone who has lost everything and still chose to stay in the profession. 11 days later, Tobias Mercer placed a thin file on Raphael's desk and said that he had found someone, but there was one thing he wanted to say first. Raphael told him to go ahead. Tobias said this person wouldn't come looking for the Santoro house on her own, that he had called 3 times and someone had only answered on the 3rd call. Marisol Vega arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, taking a bus to the beginning of the coastal road and walking the rest of the way. And when she stepped into the study, there was still sand clinging to her shoes. She was 27 years old, small in build, with brown hair tied low, and she had the hands of someone who had worked night shifts for too long. Dry fingers, nails cut close to the skin. She didn't look around the room the way other people usually did. She looked directly at the man sitting behind the desk. Raphael invited her to sit, then opened the file, but he didn't read it because he had already memorized every line 2 nights earlier. He said that before they discussed the job, he wanted her to know what kind of house she was about to enter. Then he told her. He told her the name of his family and what it had done to earn that name. He told her there were people in this city who would pay a great deal of money just to know what time he ate breakfast. He told her that 3 years earlier, a car had waited on a street corner for 4 hours looking for him, and it had found the wrong person. He told her everything in the flat, even voice of a man reading the terms of a contract, and the entire time he spoke, he watched her. This was the test. He had done exactly the same thing with the 3 people before her, and all 3 had shown one very brief moment when their pupils widened slightly, the kind of moment he had learned to read when he was 20 years old. Marisol Vega sat still with both hands resting in her lap, and she didn't blink once. When he finished, she asked only one question: whether his sister ever left the grounds of the house. Raphael went still for a few seconds. He said yes, twice a week, for therapy. She nodded, committed it to memory, and asked nothing more about anything he had just told her. Raphael closed the file and said that he had also looked into her. He said that 4 years earlier she had worked at a major hospital in the city, in the department everyone wanted to get into, and that she hadn't left because she wanted to. He said there had been a patient, and there had been a record, and someone had asked her to change a few lines in the notes from that night's shift. Marisol didn't ask how he knew about it. She only said those lines were the times I was in the patient's room, sir, and if I changed them, no one would ever know what happened during those 3 hours. Raphael asked whether she understood what they had offered her in exchange for changing a few lines. She said she understood perfectly well. They had given her the number the very next day. He asked why she had refused, and she answered that the patient's mother had asked her a question, and she didn't want to spend the rest of her life remembering that she had given the wrong answer. The room stayed silent for quite a while after that. Raphael stood, walked to the window, and turned his back to her. He said that the 3 nurses before her had all left, that the one who lasted longest had stayed almost 2 months. He said his sister would test her, that she would be pushed away, shut out, ignored, and that most of the time she wouldn't know whether she was doing the right thing. Marisol said that was the most accurate job description she had ever heard. He turned back to look at her. He asked why she was taking this job. She said her father was living in a nursing home across the river, and the monthly cost was more than everything she earned, that for 4 years not one major hospital in the city had called her back, and that she needed a job. Raphael said that wasn't the whole answer. Marisol looked at him and said the words he would remember for a very long time. I know your sister needs someone who will stay longer than 3 weeks, Mr. Santoro, and the rest isn't my business. He asked whether she wanted to meet Nadia before deciding. She said there was no need, because if she met her first and then decided, that would mean she was choosing her patient, and a nurse wasn't allowed to choose her patients. Raphael held out his hand. She shook it, her hand dry and firm, and he realized she was the first person to walk into this room in 3 years who hadn't lowered her voice when speaking about his sister. He told her she could start on Monday. She thanked him, picked up her bag, and left. From the second-floor window, Raphael watched her walk along the gravel path toward the main gate. She walked slowly and didn't look back. Then, near the gate, she stopped completely. There, mounted on the stone pillar to the left, was a brass plaque engraved with the family name, something that had been there since his grandfather's time and was polished once every week. Marisol Vega stood in front of that plaque for a very long time. She didn't touch it. She simply stood there with both hands holding the strap of her bag, reading the name carved deep into the brass over and over again, far longer than anyone would need to read 8 letters. Raphael looked down, his brow tightening slightly, and then someone knocked on the door and he turned away. Outside the gate, nearly a full minute passed before Marisol finally started walking again. On Monday morning, Marisol Vega arrived 20 minutes before her scheduled time, and no one had to show her the way to the second floor because she had carefully asked about the layout of the house during her interview, and she was the kind of person who remembered things like that. The housekeeper showed her around, reminding her of the same things the 3 people before her had been told. Don't play music too loudly. Don't open the curtains suddenly. Don't touch the blue shawl unless she allows it. Marisol nodded and didn't ask a single question. At noon, Nadia's lunch was prepared in the small sitting room on the second floor, as it was every day, and Marisol carried the tray upstairs herself. Nadia was sitting on the floor beside the window, the blue shawl draped across her lap, and in front of her were 3 colored pencils arranged perfectly parallel, their tips pointing in exactly the same direction. She didn't look up when Marisol entered. Marisol placed the tray on the low table a few steps away, told her name, and said lunch would be ready whenever she wanted it. Nadia looked up. She studied Marisol from head to toe, slowly, with the gaze of someone measuring and weighing rather than someone who was curious. Then she stood, walked over to the low table, reached out, and swept the tray onto the floor. The bowl shattered. Food spilled across the carpet. The noise made a housemaid in the hallway hurry upstairs, stopping in the doorway with her face gone pale. Nadia didn't look at the tray. She looked at Marisol. There was no anger at all in her eyes, only a very clear question, the same question she had asked the 3 people before her, and all 3 of them had answered it wrong. She was asking, "What are you going to do now?" Marisol didn't say a word. She motioned for the housemaid to leave. Then she bent down, gathered the larger broken pieces into one corner of the tray, moving slowly and neatly as though she were cleaning up something she had expected to happen. She didn't rush to scrub the stain from the carpet. She didn't say a single word about what had just happened. She went downstairs to the kitchen, took the meal she had brought from home for herself, then came back upstairs, and she sat down on the floor, not in a chair, not at the table. She sat on the floor itself, about 2 steps away from Nadia, leaned her back against the wall, opened her food container, and began to eat. Nadia stood there watching her. Marisol didn't invite her, didn't coax her, didn't ask whether she was hungry, didn't tell her that what she had done was wrong. She simply ate her own lunch, her eyes turned toward the window, and remained silent. 5 minutes passed. Nadia sat down again in her old place beside the window, turned her back, and began arranging the 3 colored pencils again. 10 minutes. Marisol finished eating, closed the container, set it beside her, and stayed exactly where she was. 20 minutes. The housemaid passed the doorway for the second time, looked inside, then kept walking. 30 minutes. Nadia had stopped arranging the pencils. She sat still with both hands resting on the shawl, and every so often she cast a very quick glance toward the wall where the other woman was sitting, glances so brief that anyone who wasn't waiting for them would have missed them. Marisol caught all 4. She didn't react to any of them. At the 40th minute, Nadia stood up. She took the blue shawl with her, walked across the room, and sat down on the floor beside Marisol, about an arm's length away, her back against the wall too. Her eyes turned toward the window too. She didn't say anything. Marisol didn't turn toward her either. They sat that way for a while longer, and only much later did Marisol speak, very softly, without looking over, saying, "I didn't come here to make you behave, Nadia. I came so you wouldn't have to sit alone." Nadia didn't answer, but she pulled at the shawl and spread one edge of it across the floor between them. That was everything that happened on the first afternoon. No one raised their voice. No one was punished. No one called the owner of the house to report what had happened. At 5 o'clock, Marisol finished cleaning the carpet, changed the bedsheets, wrote a few lines in her notebook, and left exactly on time. That night, close to 1 o'clock in the morning, Rafael Santoro came home, and the housekeeper was about to tell him about the broken bowl. But he went upstairs before she had the chance to speak. He entered his study, opened the camera system, and rewound the footage from the second-floor hallway. He stopped at the frame from 12:40 in the afternoon, when the new woman sat down on the floor with her food container in her hands. He didn't fast forward. He sat there and watched all 40 minutes at their real pace, 40 minutes of 2 people sitting silently in one room, and he watched until the moment his sister stood, crossed the room, and sat down beside a stranger. He rewound that part. He watched it a second time. Then he leaned back in his chair, raised one hand to cover his eyes, and sat for a very long time in the darkness of the study. In 3 years, no one had ever managed to do that. Not even him. The next morning, when Tobias asked how the new woman was doing, Raphael only said to let her do her job. He didn't tell anyone about that recording, and he didn't delete it either. 3 weeks after that first day, on a Friday afternoon, Nadia came down to the kitchen. She came alone and without warning, and the sight of her made the cook freeze in the middle of the room, because in 3 years, the girl had never come down there by herself. She was holding a worn brown cloth-bound notebook in her arms, its corners rubbed soft with age. She placed it on the stone counter in front of Marisol, opened it to the exact page she wanted, and pushed it toward her. Marisol dried her hands and leaned down to look. It was a woman's handwriting, slanted across the page in faded blue ink, and along the margin were 2 old smears of flour that had long since worked their way into the paper. Nadia said these were almond cakes, and Mother made them on rainy days. Marisol asked if she wanted to try making them. Nadia said the other 3 always said another day. Marisol read through the recipe once, then asked whether there was still almond flour in the kitchen, and the cook hurried off to look for it with the expression of a man who had just been entrusted with the most important task of the month. They worked for 2 hours. Marisol didn't do anything for her. She read each line aloud and let Nadia weigh everything herself, mix everything herself, pour the batter into the pan herself, and when an egg yolk slipped outside the bowl, she didn't reach out to catch it. Nadia ruined the first batch. The cakes collapsed and one edge burned. She stood staring at the tray for a long time, both hands clenched together, and Marisol understood that this was the moment that would decide the entire afternoon. She didn't say, "It's all right." She didn't say, "You did great." She only said it wasn't burned. It had simply spent a little too much time feeling confident. Then she broke off a piece from the unburned side, ate it, and said they should use a little less heat for the next batch. Nadia laughed. It was the first sound of laughter heard in that kitchen since the spring 3 years earlier, and the cook had to turn away and wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. The second batch came out right. Nadia arranged the cakes on a plate, counted them again and again, until there were exactly 12, then said 2 had to be set aside. Marisol asked who they were for. Nadia said for Raphael, because he came home late and he often ate standing up in the kitchen. Marisol stopped moving for a few seconds, then said in that case they should set aside 3, in case he was hungrier than usual. While they waited for the cakes to cool, Nadia continued flipping through the notebook. She turned the pages slowly, naming each dish as though she were calling out the names of familiar people. Apple pie, squash soup, breakfast eggs, and Marisol sat beside her and listened. Then Nadia turned to one page and stopped. There was a gap in the middle of the notebook. It wasn't a blank page. A page had been torn out, leaving behind a thin, jagged strip of paper clinging to the binding. And on the following page, there were faint impressions of pen strokes that had once pressed through from the missing sheet. Marisol ran one finger lightly along the torn edge. Very gently, she asked where this page was. Nadia. Nadia looked down and answered in the calmest voice possible. The voice of someone stating an obvious truth everyone already knew. Mother hid that. Then she turned to the next page and began naming the next dish. Marisol asked where Mother had hidden it. Nadia didn't answer. She had already moved on to something else. And Marisol understood that if she pressed with even one more question, the whole afternoon would close itself off. So she left it alone. But that night, when she wrote down the day's events in her own notebook, she added one extra line at the bottom of the page about the missing page in the recipe book, and she didn't know why she felt the need to record it. 3 nights later, close to 11 o'clock, Marisol stayed later than usual because Nadia wouldn't go to sleep. She sat on the low chair beside the bed with the bedside lamp turned down to its dimmest setting, and she didn't say anything. She simply sat there the way she had on that first afternoon on the floor. Nadia turned over several times. Then, in the darkness, without opening her eyes, she called out. She didn't call her Miss Vega. She didn't call her nurse. She called her Mari and asked whether she would come tomorrow. It took Marisol a moment before she could answer, and when she did, her voice was slightly rough. She said yes, 8 o'clock in the morning, just like every day. Nadia told her to remember to use the back door, because there was a draft at the front door in the morning. Then she fell asleep. Outside in the hallway, at the top of the stairs, Rafael Santoro was standing there. He had come home at 10:30 and had reached the final stair when he heard voices coming from his sister's room, so he stopped. He had been standing there ever since, one hand resting on the banister, and he had heard everything. He heard his sister call someone else's name in the darkness, using the familiar voice he hadn't heard in 3 years, and he heard her warning about the draft at the front door, the kind of thing someone only said after they had grown accustomed to another person being there for a long time. He remained perfectly still. He didn't go downstairs. In the kitchen, beneath the food cover, 3 almond cakes still sat untouched on a plate, and no one had told him they had been saved for him. Priscilla Hale entered the house in Marblehead for the first time on a Sunday evening, near the end of the month, and she entered it like someone who had stood outside the gates long enough to know exactly whom she needed to smile at first. Raphael had met her at a charity auction 3 months earlier, where she had been the only person in the room who didn't ask what he did for a living. She was 31 years old, owned an art gallery on Newbury Street, spoke in a soft, unhurried voice, and had a gift for standing in exactly the right place in a room, so the light fell on her beautifully without anyone thinking she had done it on purpose. That evening, she brought a paper box tied with a cloth ribbon, and what was inside wasn't perfume or a silk scarf, but a set of 48 colored pencils, the kind real artists used, each one with its own name printed along the barrel. She didn't give them to Nadia in front of everyone. She left the box on the table in the second-floor hallway and told Marisol that if she felt there was a good time to give it to her, then please do. And if she felt the time wasn't right yet, then she could simply put it away, because you understand this better than I do. Marisol thanked her and placed the box of pencils in a cabinet. That night, she wrote in her notebook that a guest had come. There was a gift, and it hadn't been given yet. At the dinner table downstairs, Priscilla mentioned Marisol twice. The first time, she told Raphael that she had just been upstairs and that the hallway didn't feel the way it had 3 months earlier. The second time, when Rosalind Santoro pressed her and asked what could possibly be so special about one nurse, Priscilla set down her fork and said, "Ma'am, the 3 before her were nurses too, but this is the only one who knows how to sit quietly, and I think that's something they can't teach in school." Rosalind said nothing. Raphael looked at the woman sitting across from him and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 3 years. The relief of having someone walk into this house without being afraid of it. 2 days later, Tobias Mercer placed a file on Raphael's desk, thicker than usual, and sat down without waiting to be invited. He said he had spent 3 weeks having Priscilla Hale investigated. Raphael asked what they had found. Tobias said nothing. Raphael said, "Then that's good." Tobias said, "No, sir, it isn't good." Then he opened the file and began speaking in the manner of a man who had been doing this work for 18 years. He said the gallery on Newbury Street did steady business, no losses, no sudden jumps in profit, and its books were so clean they were almost pleasing to look at. He said there were no loans, no lawsuits, not a single line in the press for 10 years except for 2 articles about exhibitions. He said he had even found people who had once worked with her, and no one could say anything bad about her, but no one could say anything specific either. Raphael asked where the problem was. Then, Tobias tapped one finger against the file and said he had investigated hundreds of people in his life, and anyone who reached 31 ought to have left behind a few stains: a debt, a broken relationship, one tax return that came up short, an old friend who was still angry. He said no one reached 31 that clean, unless somebody had been cleaning up after them. Raphael leaned back in his chair. He didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth moved. He said perhaps Tobias had been in this business so long that he no longer believed decent people existed. Tobias said he still believed in decent people. He simply didn't believe decent people left no trace behind them. Raphael stood, walked to the window, and said the words that would later cost him 3 years of his own memories. "Mr. Mercer, I've sat behind this desk for 90 months, and not once have I misjudged a person." Tobias didn't argue. He simply closed the file, stood, and before leaving the room, added that he would keep it in a drawer in case Raphael changed his mind. Raphael said, "I won't change my mind." And it wasn't laziness. It was the arrogance of a 34-year-old man who had grown accustomed to believing that his instincts were the most reliable thing in any room. The following Friday evening, Priscilla came to dinner for the 3rd time. At around 9 o'clock, she excused herself to take a call in the hallway because a business partner in California was calling. The western hallway of the house was long and covered in thick carpet, and if someone stood at the bend near the glass door, their voice wouldn't carry into the dining room. Priscilla stood in exactly that spot. She spoke quietly, her voice still as gentle as it had been at the dinner table, saying, "Don't get impatient. This can't be rushed." She listened for a moment, then said, "He isn't the kind of man who can be pushed. He's the kind of man who has to walk toward it himself." Then she spoke the final sentence, and she said it in the voice of someone calculating a long-term investment. "I only need 6 months and 1 signature. And after that, everything in that house can be rearranged." She ended the call, adjusted her bracelet, and returned to the dining room with the smile of someone who had just finished handling a matter of business. At the far end of the hallway, about 15 steps away, the door to the storage room stood slightly open. There was no one inside, but the blue shawl was draped over the back of a chair, in exactly the place where someone had forgotten it that afternoon. The therapy center in Salem held an art exhibition on Saturday afternoon, once every year, and this year Nadia had 2 paintings hanging on the walls. She had learned about it 11 days earlier, and during those 11 days she asked her brother 4 times. The first time, he said he would check his schedule. The second time, he said he was sure he could make it. The third time, when she asked again over breakfast, he set down his coffee cup, looked his sister directly in the eyes, and said he promised. The 4th time was Saturday morning, when she stood in the doorway of his study, wearing the outfit she had chosen the night before, and he told her he would be there at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. "Now go before you're late." The exhibition began at 2 o'clock. Marisol took her there, sat in the last row of chairs, and for the entire first hour Nadia never took her eyes off the glass doors. Every time they opened, she turned to look. By 3 o'clock, the doors had opened 8 times, and not once was it him. By 3:20, the coordinator began inviting each family to stand beside their child's artwork for photographs. Nadia didn't go up. She said she wanted to wait a little longer. By 4 o'clock, they began clearing away the refreshment table. By 4:30, only 3 families remained in the gallery. Marisol didn't say a single word during those 2 hours. She didn't say, "I'm sure he's on his way." She didn't say, "Let's go home." She simply sat beside her, and when Nadia began digging her fingers into the edge of the shawl, Marisol placed one hand over the back of the girl's hand, not squeezing, simply leaving it there. The coordinator came over twice to ask whether he should dim the lights in that section, and both times Marisol asked him to leave them on a little longer. At 10 minutes to 5, the black car stopped in front of the center. Raphael walked into the nearly empty gallery, still wearing his suit jacket, and he stopped in the middle of the aisle when he saw his sister still sitting in the last row, her face turned toward the door, waiting. Nadia sprang to her feet. She didn't accuse him of anything. She simply ran over, took his hand, and said, "You came. My paintings are over there. There are 2. The one on the left is our kitchen." He let her pull him along. He stood in front of the 2 paintings for a long time. The first showed the kitchen, with 3 plates on the table. The second showed a window looking out toward the sea, and in the lower right corner, there was a patch of blue that he recognized immediately as the shawl. The coordinator turned the lights back on in that section so he could take a photograph. Nadia stood between the 2 paintings, smiling, and in that photograph no one would ever have guessed that she had been sitting there waiting for 2 hours and 40 minutes. On the way out to the parking lot, Nadia ran ahead, and Raphael slowed until he was walking beside Marisol. He said thank you for waiting with her. Marisol said, "I wasn't waiting, I just didn't let her leave." He asked why. She said because if I had taken her home at 4 o'clock, then tonight she would have explained it to herself by saying her brother was busy, that she wasn't as important as his work, and she would have believed that explanation far longer than the amount of time you were late. Raphael stopped walking. He said he had tried. He said 3 people had flown in from other places for that meeting and he couldn't simply stand up and leave in the middle of it. Marisol said, "I believe you." Then she continued, very calmly, "But your sister believes every promise you make, Mr. Santoro. That's why every one of them carries weight." Raphael turned fully toward her. In 3 years, no employee in his house had ever spoken to him in that tone. He said, "You speak as though you understand my family better than I do." Marisol didn't step back. She said, "No, sir. I've simply been sitting here longer than you have." Then she added that at 3:20 they invited families up for photographs, and she didn't go because she didn't want to stand alone in that picture. At 4 o'clock they cleared the refreshment table, and she was still sitting there. At 4:30 there were only 3 families left, and she asked me whether she might have remembered the wrong day. When Marisol finished speaking, she continued toward the car without waiting for an answer, and Raphael remained standing in the middle of the parking lot for a while. On the way home, Nadia sat in the back seat and talked endlessly about the painting of the kitchen and the 3 plates, and Raphael answered at all the right moments, but his eyes kept shifting toward the rearview mirror, where he could see the reflection of the woman sitting beside his sister, looking straight ahead at the road. That night, he went into his study, opened the schedule for the following week, and sat for a very long time staring at the Saturday column. Then he called his secretary and said that from now on, any appointment that conflicted with his sister's therapy sessions was to be moved, and no one was to ask him again. It was the first time in 3 years that he had given an instruction like that, and he didn't tell anyone why. Marisol Vega lived on the 3rd floor of an old building across the river, in a 1-room apartment, and every evening by the time she got home, most of the city lights had already gone dark. Sunday was the only day she didn't go to Marblehead, and every Sunday she took 2 buses to reach the nursing home in Chelsea. Her father was 68 years old, and had been in a wheelchair for 4 years, and there were days when he remembered everything, and days when he called her by her mother's name. That day was a good one. He asked how the new job was going. She said she worked for a family by the sea, taking care of a 19-year-old girl. He asked whether the girl behaved herself. Marisol said she was like Diego. She tested people before she let them in. At the sound of that name, the old man fell silent for a long time, then turned his face toward the window and said, "Don't tell anyone about that." Marisol said, "I know." On the way home, she sat in the last row of the bus and took from an inner compartment of her bag a yellowed envelope, something she had carried with her for 10 years, not because she needed to read it again, but because she didn't trust leaving it anywhere. Diego Vega died when he was 9 years old. The boy had a defect in one of the valves of his heart, something the doctors said could be repaired before he turned 10, and if the operation was done in time, he could live a completely normal life. Her family didn't have the money. But that year, a medical sponsorship program run by a charitable foundation had accepted the boy's application, scheduled the surgery, and given them a date. Marisol was 17 then. With her own hands, she taped the calendar to the refrigerator and circled March 19th in red ink. Diego counted down every day. He said that after the operation he would be able to run, and he asked his sister whether running made you very tired. 11 days before the surgery, the sponsorship was withdrawn. It wasn't the hospital that refused. The sponsor withdrew its signature. Her mother called for 2 straight weeks, went twice to the office in Boston, and both times she was stopped at the reception desk. They said it was an internal decision. They said the foundation was restructuring its support portfolio. They said it using long, clean words, the kind of words no one could argue with. The surgery was moved onto a waiting list. Diego didn't live long enough to reach his turn. The boy died in September of that year, and on the refrigerator in their home, the calendar with the red circle stayed hanging there for another 2 years because no one in the family had the courage to take it down. 7 years later, her mother died of cancer. Marisol went through her papers and found, at the very bottom of a tin box, an envelope her mother had never shown anyone. Inside was a copy of the letter, announcing the withdrawal of sponsorship. Half a page, 3 paragraphs, and at the top was the embossed letterhead of an investment company headquartered on State Street. Marisol hadn't known what that name meant until she looked it up when she was 23, and it took her another 2 nights to trace the company back and discover that it belonged to a group of businesses owned by a single family, the Santoro family. She had stood in front of the brass plaque at the gate of the Marblehead house on the day of her interview, not because the plaque was beautiful. She had stood there because for 10 years she had only ever seen that name on paper, and that day was the first time she had seen it carved deep into brass, polished once every week. The first time Tobias Mercer called, she hung up. The second time, she listened to everything and said, "Let me think about it." The third time, she asked him only one question, whether his employer conducted the interview himself. And when he said yes, she accepted the job during that very call. She hadn't gone to that house because of the nursing home bills, although the nursing home bills were real. She had gone because she wanted to see with her own eyes the man who carried the name printed at the top of that letter. She wanted to know what a man like that looked like when he ate breakfast, when he laughed, when he lied. In her mind, she had prepared herself for everything she expected to see, and she had prepared herself for how much she was going to hate him. But then she went upstairs to the 2nd floor and met a 19-year-old girl sitting on the floor, carefully arranging 3 colored pencils so they lined up perfectly. A girl who wasn't responsible for any of this, a girl who had lost her mother too, who had also had someone taken away from her without anyone asking permission. And suddenly, everything Marisol had prepared for became useless. That night, when she returned to her apartment, she sat on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope to read the letter again, as she did a few times every year. She read those 3 clean paragraphs from beginning to end. Then she thought about Nadia's hand resting on the blue shawl in the gallery the afternoon before, and about the very quiet question asking whether perhaps she had remembered the wrong day. Marisol folded the letter, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it in the bottom drawer instead of carrying it with her as she always had. She didn't know what she was going to do with it. She knew only one thing for certain, that she wouldn't use it to hurt that girl. And on the other side of the city, inside the house by the sea, the man who had just ordered every meeting that conflicted with his sister's therapy sessions to be moved was sitting in his study, completely unaware that the woman he had just trusted with his sister had walked through his gates, carrying another name in her bag, the name of a 9-year-old boy he had never heard of. Priscilla Hale moved into the house in Marblehead during the first week of October, and she moved in a way that made it impossible for anyone to object, little by little. First, there was a suitcase left behind after Sunday dinner, then 2 dresses hanging in the closet of the east guest room. Then, one morning, a housemaid noticed that there were 4 place settings on the dining table instead of 3, and no one could remember exactly when that had begun. By the end of the month, she was calling it home. The first thing she did wasn't change the curtains or move the furniture. The first thing she did was print out a sheet of paper. On Wednesday evening, she placed it on the dining table in front of Raphael and said she had spent 3 weeks reviewing Nadia's daily routine, not because she wanted to interfere, only because she wanted to understand. The paper contained a neatly printed, color-coded schedule, divided by hour. She explained every line. She said the afternoon drawing period was lasting 3 continuous hours, and as far as she knew, no activity should last 3 hours for someone undergoing treatment, so it should be reduced to 1.5 hours, with a quiet rest period added after lunch. She said the household was allowing the girl to make too many decisions about her own day, and that someone who needed structure couldn't be expected to build that structure for herself. Then she brought up the doctor. She said the current doctor had been treating Nadia for 3 years, and 3 years was a long time, that she wasn't criticizing him in any way, But sometimes a new perspective could notice something that a person who had been there too long could no longer see. She had the name of a specialist in Brookline, the same person Rosalind had mentioned before. Raphael picked up the paper and read it. He read it very carefully, and the problem was that everything written there sounded reasonable, line by line. There wasn't a single malicious sentence. There wasn't a single unreasonable one. He looked up and said she'd spent 3 weeks on this. Priscilla said she'd spent 3 weeks because she didn't want to walk into this house and start giving orders. She wanted to understand first. Raphael folded the paper and said they would begin trying it on Monday. Marisol learned about it on Thursday morning, when the sheet was posted on the cabinet door in the second-floor hallway. She stood there and read the whole thing, then went to find Priscilla and asked for 5 minutes to talk. She spoke in exactly the professional tone she always used, not even half a note louder. She said the 3 hours of afternoon drawing weren't really 3 hours of drawing. They were 3 hours in the only state Nadia was able to choose for herself. And if they cut that down to an hour and a half, what would be lost wasn't 90 minutes. It was the feeling that there was a part of the day that belonged to her. She said a quiet rest period after lunch sounded good. But for someone with Nadia's history, sitting alone in a room with the door closed was dangerous rather than restful. She said changing doctors at this stage was the most significant thing on the entire sheet, because it had taken Nadia 3 years to begin talking to the doctor she had now, and a therapeutic relationship wasn't a service where you simply switched providers. Priscilla listened to everything, without interrupting once, and when Marisol finished, she smiled and thanked her. Then she said Marisol made very good points, and she would think about them. Then she added one more sentence, still in that same gentle voice. But Marisol, decisions like these are family matters. You're the nurse, not family. Marisol didn't answer back. She nodded, said yes, ma'am, then went upstairs to finish her morning work. That evening, when she returned to her apartment across the river, she took out a new notebook, the hardbound kind, and on the first page she wrote the patient's name, the starting date, and the name of the person keeping the record. Then she wrote the first entry. Date, time, activity, response, who was present in the room. She wrote it exactly the way they had taught her in nursing school 9 years earlier. The same thing she had done on every shift throughout her career, and had stopped doing after leaving the major hospital because no one required it in a private home. She didn't write a single negative word about Priscilla Hale. She didn't write that one person was wrong and another was right. She simply recorded what happened, the times, and the people who were present, in the exact order the events occurred. She wasn't doing it to accuse anyone. She was doing it because that was procedure, and because over the past 4 years she had learned one very expensive lesson, that when everyone was telling a different story, the only thing that remained standing was what had been written down at the moment things were actually happening. She closed the notebook, placed it in the drawer beside the yellowed envelope, and turned off the light. The new schedule began the following Monday. By Friday, Nadia had stopped bringing the blue shawl down to the kitchen in the morning, and no one in that house noticed except one person. The first storm of the season struck the northern Massachusetts coast on Tuesday evening, and by close to 9 o'clock, the entire Marblehead area had lost power. The house by the sea had a backup generator, but that generator needed 40 seconds to start, and 40 seconds inside a large house felt longer than 40 seconds anywhere else. Raphael was in his ground floor study with the door closed, listening to a call from Chicago. When the lights went out, he simply switched the phone to speaker and kept talking. The generator came on, the hallway lights returned, and he didn't give the outage another second of thought. Priscilla had left the east sitting room about 10 minutes earlier to take a phone call in the west hallway, and when the power failed, she continued on to the family room near the glass doors, where the signal was stronger, and she stayed there. She didn't come back inside. Upstairs, when the darkness fell, Nadia was alone in her room because under the new schedule, her quiet evening rest lasted from 8:30 until 9 o'clock, with the door closed and the lights kept low. At that moment, Marisol was downstairs in the kitchen, washing the blood pressure equipment and getting ready to leave. The power went out. She put everything down immediately. She didn't wait for the generator. She took the flashlight from the second drawer on the left, the one whose batteries she had checked during her very first week on the job, and ran upstairs. She heard it before she saw anything. From the far end of the second-floor hallway, in the darkness, came the sound of breathing. Not crying, not calling out, just breathing, short and fast, and piling on top of itself. The sound of someone trying to pull air in and not being able to get enough. Marisol didn't shine the flashlight directly into the room. She lowered the beam toward the floor so the light reflected softly up the wall, then called her own name from outside the door, loud and clear, saying, "It's Mari, Nadia, I'm at the door." She said it a second time. Then she opened the door and went in. Nadia was standing in the middle of the room beside the foot of the bed, and the blue shawl was lying on the floor several steps away because she hadn't been able to find it in the dark. Marisol picked up the shawl, moved toward her slowly, sat down on the floor at a careful distance from the girl, and placed the shawl into her hands. Then she did the only thing that worked in moments like that, the kind of thing no color-coded schedule could ever teach. She began to count. She counted slowly. In, 1, 2, 3, 4, out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And she counted aloud, matching the rhythm to her own breathing, so Nadia would have something to hold on to. The first time, Nadia couldn't follow. The second time, she couldn't either. By the fourth time, one breath matched. Marisol didn't stop. She kept counting, 20 times, 30 times, and she didn't say a single thing besides those numbers. She didn't say it's all right. She didn't say calm down, because she knew that right then, every word was only more noise. 40 seconds passed, then 1 minute, then 2. The hallway lights came back first, followed by the light in the room. When the light returned, Nadia was sitting on the floor with the shawl wrapped around one arm, and her other hand was gripping Marisol's hand tightly. She didn't let go. She held on for a long while, the two of them sitting on the floor in the brightly lit room as her breathing slowly became even again. Marisol said, "It's over now. The lights are back. I'm sitting right here." Nadia nodded. Then she asked very quietly whether Raphael had been home when it happened. Marisol said yes. Nadia didn't ask anything else. 10 minutes later, when Raphael finished his call and came upstairs, everything was already over. He saw his sister sitting on the edge of the bed, the blue shawl across her lap, her hair stuck to her forehead, and he saw the nurse sitting on the floor beside her. He asked what had happened. Marisol stood and began to explain that when the power went out, Nadia had been alone in her room with the door closed under the evening schedule, that she had reached her after about 40 seconds, and that it had taken roughly 3 minutes for Nadia's breathing to stabilize. She spoke in the voice of a report, adding nothing beyond the facts. Priscilla appeared in the doorway when Marisol reached the second sentence. She stepped inside, placed a hand on Nadia's shoulder, and said, "Oh, you poor thing," then turned to Raphael and said the generator was much too slow. They needed to have someone inspect it. She said she'd been out in the family room because the signal was better there and she'd gone out to take a call. Otherwise, if she'd known, she would have run upstairs immediately. Then she said the most important sentence of all. Gently, without emphasizing it. "Actually, it was only a little more than 2 minutes, Raphael." Marisol got upstairs very quickly. "Everything's fine now. Don't make too much of it or you'll frighten her again." Raphael looked from one woman to the other. He had 2 versions in front of him. One version had details, time markers, and an unanswered question about why the bedroom door had been closed at that hour. The other version was neat and smooth, and ended with "everything's fine now." And he chose the second version, not because he was lazy, but because the second version allowed him to go to bed, while the first required him to keep asking questions about the schedule he himself had agreed to try. He said he would have the generator inspected the next day. He bent down, kissed his sister's hair, told her to get some rest, and walked out. Marisol stood there and watched him leave. She didn't argue a single word. She finished straightening the room, dimmed the lights, waited until Nadia was fully asleep, then went downstairs. That night, by the time she reached her apartment, it was almost 1 o'clock in the morning. Yet she still opened the hardbound notebook and recorded everything in full. The date, the time, the power failed, the time it took for the generator to start, the condition of the bedroom door, the duration of the panic attack, and on the final line under who was present, she wrote exactly 3 words and added no comment at all. Nadia Santoro turned 19 on November 12th, and for the past 3 years, that day in the Marblehead house had always been handled the same way. There was cake, there were gifts, and no one mentioned what had happened the year before. But this year, 2 weeks before her birthday, Nadia brought the blue shawl down to the kitchen and asked Marisol whether she knew how to sew. Marisol said she knew a little. Nadia said she wanted to wear this on her birthday, but it was a shawl, and shawls kept falling down, and she didn't want it to fall. Marisol took the shawl in her hands. It was made of thin, hand-woven wool, deep blue, frayed at both ends. and one corner bore a small burn mark the size of a fingertip from some long-forgotten time. She said that if they cut it, there would be no going back, Nadia. So she had to be certain. Nadia said she was certain. Marisol asked her again the next day, and Nadia gave the same answer. So she did it. She didn't cut much. She only separated the most intact portion of the shawl and sewed it into a detachable collar that could be fastened onto the gray sweater Nadia often wore. And she kept the corner with the burn mark exactly as it was, placing it on the inside where only the person wearing it would know it was there. She worked on it at night in her own room, in the apartment across the river after finishing work. And it took her 4 nights. On the morning of November 12th, Nadia came downstairs to breakfast wearing that sweater. Raphael was standing at the kitchen island with a cup of coffee in his hand, and he saw his sister coming down the stairs with that familiar patch of blue around her collar. He set the cup down. For about 5 seconds, he didn't say anything. Then he walked over, lowered himself onto one knee so they were at the same level, and touched the edge of the fabric with the tips of 2 fingers the way someone might touch something fragile. Nadia said Mari made it, and it doesn't fall anymore. Raphael stood, turned toward Marisol, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, and opened his mouth to say something ordinary, but the words wouldn't come. He had to stop, take a breath, and then he said, "You gave my sister something I've kept locked inside a box for 3 years. Marisol said she asked for it, sir. I only sewed it into something she could wear. He said I haven't opened that box once in 3 years either." After saying that, he turned away, walked out onto the porch, and stood there for quite a long time before coming back inside. That afternoon, more than a dozen people came, close relatives, 2 friends from the therapy center, Rosalind and Priscilla, who stood at the door welcoming guests in a role no one had officially given her, but no one objected to either. The cake was cut at 4 o'clock. Afterward, Nadia disappeared for about half an hour, and when she returned, she was carrying a sheet of paper with paint still wet on it. She walked straight to the empty wall beside the staircase, the place where nothing had hung for 3 years, and asked a housemaid to bring her some tape. The picture showed 3 people standing beside one another, in front of a window overlooking the sea. The person on the left was the tallest and wore dark clothes. The person in the middle was the smallest, and had a patch of blue at the collar. The person on the right wore gray, and had her hair tied low. There was no one else in the picture. Nadia taped it to the wall with 4 pieces of tape, 1 at each corner, stepped back to look at it, then said that was good. Voices in the living room praised the picture. Raphael stood a few steps away and said nothing. Priscilla looked at the drawing for about 2 seconds, smiled, then turned and walked out onto the west porch, with her phone in her hand. Half an hour later, Nadia couldn't find the shawl. Not the collar she was wearing, but the remaining part of the shawl, the piece Marisol had folded neatly and returned to her inside a cloth bag. She remembered leaving it in the family room before the cake was cut. She went looking for it alone, through the west hallway, walking as quietly as she always did. The glass door leading onto the porch was slightly open. Outside, Priscilla was standing with her back to the house, holding the phone to her ear, her voice as gentle as ever. Nadia stopped because she didn't want to disturb someone who was on the phone. That was a rule in the house, and she waited. She heard about 30 seconds of the conversation. She didn't understand most of what she heard. She heard the word June, the word paperwork, and the words he'll sign. She heard Priscilla say that the place was good, that the specialists were good, that it was far away, but that was actually better. And she heard 2 words she had never heard before, 2 words together. A name. She remembered it because the second sound reminded her of the word forest, and because Priscilla repeated it twice in a single sentence. Then she heard footsteps turning around, so she stepped back inside, walked the other way down the hallway, and found the cloth bag beneath the chair in the family room exactly where she had left it. She carried it back to her room in her arms. That evening, when Marisol came in to say goodnight, Nadia said, "Mari, do you know a place called something like Grove?" Marisol asked where she had heard it. Nadia said she had forgotten, then rolled onto her side and asked whether she could keep drawing tomorrow. Marisol said yes. She stayed for a little while longer, then turned off the bedside lamp and left the room. On the wall beside the staircase, the picture of the 3 people was still taped there, held by 4 pieces of tape at the 4 corners, and throughout that entire evening, no one in the house touched it. 3 days after her birthday, on a Friday morning, Nadia came down to the kitchen earlier than usual and stood waiting outside the study until her brother opened the door and stepped out. She said she needed to ask him something. Raphael was holding his coat in one hand and was already 20 minutes late. He told her to go ahead, and Nadia began to speak, but she couldn't quite get the words out. She said that on her birthday, out on the porch, someone had been talking on the phone, and they had mentioned June, and mentioned some kind of paperwork, and there was a place, a name, somewhere far away, but that was supposed to be better. She stopped. She tried to remember the order of it, but the order wouldn't come back. She said the name had a G sound in it, and the sound after that was something like forest. And she repeated the sound 2 or 3 times, differently each time. Raphael looked at his sister. He saw the way her fingers dug into the edge of her sweater, the way the words came out without any order, and he saw exactly what he had seen hundreds of times over the past 3 years. He bent down, placed a hand on her shoulder, and spoke in the gentlest voice he had, saying, "You heard it wrong, Nadia." She said, "I didn't hear it wrong." He said the doctor had adjusted her evening dosage just last week, and lately she had been confusing dreams with things that had really happened, and that was normal. He said no one was going anywhere, no one was going to do anything to her. "I'm here." Nadia fell silent. She looked at her brother for a while, then said, "All right," and turned back upstairs. Raphael watched until she disappeared around the bend in the staircase, and he felt relieved that he had dealt with the matter before leaving the house. 3 years later, when he remembered that Friday morning, what kept him awake wasn't that he had been wrong. It was that he had been wrong while smiling and resting his hand on his sister's shoulder. At noon that day, his secretary brought him a stack of personnel documents that needed his signature, and among them was one sheet Tobias had slipped in. It was an employment verification notice sent by a community clinic in Somerville, asking about Miss Marisol Vega's period of employment at the Marblehead address. Raphael read it twice. Then he pressed the call button and asked for her to be sent downstairs. Marisol came down 10 minutes later, still wearing gloves because she had been in the middle of something. He pushed the paper across the desk. He asked when she was planning to leave. She looked at the paper, and she didn't appear unsettled for even a second, which only irritated him more. She said, "That was an application I submitted in August, before I came here. They're only answering now." He asked whether she had replied to them yet. She said no. He asked how she intended to answer. Marisol said, "Sir, that's my business." Raphael stood up. He asked whether there was something insufficient about the pay here. She said no. The pay here was higher than what they offered. He asked then why. And she said, "Because a private duty nurse always has to understand when her work is going to end, sir. That's the first thing they teach us." He asked when. Then. Marisol removed her gloves, folded them together, and answered in the calmest voice he had ever heard anyone use in that room, "When this house no longer needs me." "That's not your decision." Raphael couldn't find another sentence to say. She asked whether there was anything else, sir, and when he didn't answer, she walked out, and it wasn't until the door closed that he realized he had just asked her 3 questions, and not one of them belonged to a man speaking as the owner of the house. That afternoon, around 4 o'clock, Priscilla walked past the wall beside the staircase. She stopped in front of the picture of the 3 people, stood looking at it for a while, then carefully peeled away each of the 4 pieces of tape at the corners without tearing the paper. Nadia came down the hall just as she finished. She asked, "What are you doing?" Priscilla said, "I'm putting it away so it doesn't get dusty, sweetheart. Drawing paper will be ruined if it's left hanging on the wall like this." She walked over to the low cabinet at the foot of the stairs, opened the top drawer, placed the picture inside, and closed it. Then she turned the small key in the lock, pulled it out, and slipped it into her pocket. Nadia stood looking at the drawer. She said, "I want to put it back up." Priscilla smiled, reached out and stroked her hair, and said in the gentlest voice imaginable, "Family pictures are only for family, sweetheart. If we hang it on the wall, guests will ask questions, and we don't want anyone asking difficult questions, do we?" Then she went upstairs. Nadia didn't cry. She didn't call for anyone. She simply stood in front of that low cabinet for a little longer, then went back to her room. The next morning, she didn't come down to the kitchen. That afternoon, when it was time to draw, she said, "I don't want to draw today." The second day was the same. Marisol didn't ask why. She didn't coax her, didn't try to persuade her, didn't tell her to draw because it might make her feel better. On the first morning, she placed a blank sheet of paper and a pencil outside Nadia's door, then went to do something else. By evening, the paper was still blank, so she took it away. On the second morning, She placed another sheet there with another pencil. That evening, she took them away again. On the third morning, she set down the paper exactly as she had on the previous 2 days, didn't say a word, and went downstairs to the kitchen. Close to noon, when she returned to the second-floor hallway, the sheet of paper was no longer on the floor. Nadia's door was slightly open, and inside, Nadia was sitting on the floor beside the window with the paper resting on her lap and the pencil in her hand. Marisol didn't go in. She stood outside the doorway, and she let the girl keep drawing. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon near the end of November, and it didn't come through the mail. Marisol found it inside her private locker in the staff changing room, tucked between 2 clean uniforms, and she knew for certain that it hadn't been there that morning. The envelope was ivory-colored, with no stamp, no address, not a single word written on the outside. She didn't open it inside the house. She put it in her bag, finished her shift, wished Nadia good night, then took the bus back across the river as she did every evening. Only when she sat down on the edge of the bed in her one-room apartment did she open it. Inside were 2 photocopied sheets of paper. The first was a reservation confirmation form from a long-term residential facility in the state of Vermont for adults requiring specialized care. The name of the facility was printed in bold at the top, and Marisol read it, then had to read it a second time, because the second sound in the name sounded exactly like what a 19-year-old girl had been trying to describe with the word forest. Ashwood Grove. The second sheet was a receipt for a deposit securing a place for 3 months, paid by bank transfer, with the payment dated almost 7 weeks earlier. On the contact line was a name printed in block letters, and that name wasn't Priscilla Hale, but another surname, her mother's maiden name, something Marisol had no way of knowing at the time. But in the notes section, on the final line, there was a short sentence about the person who would be admitted to the facility, and in that sentence were an age, a gender, and the first 2 initials of a name. Marisol sat very still for a long time with the 2 sheets resting across her lap. Outside the window, cars passed by, and their headlights swept across the ceiling in waves. She thought about that Friday morning when Nadia had stood outside the study trying to put together a story she didn't have enough words to tell. She thought about her brother's answer, that you heard it wrong. And she thought about the simplest thing of all, that all she had to do was carry these 2 sheets 15 kilometers toward the sea, place them on his desk, and everything would be over in a single evening. She sat with that thought for 2 hours. Then she began thinking in the opposite direction, and that was when everything fell apart. She asked herself what Rafael Santoro would see when he looked at those 2 sheets of paper. He would see a nurse who had been inside his house for 4 months, a nurse his sister had clung to, a nurse he himself had asked 3 questions that were none of his business in his study just the week before. He would see that woman standing in front of him, holding evidence against the woman who was about to become his wife, at exactly the moment when Priscilla had just taken down a picture from the wall that included the nurse in it. And the first question he would ask wouldn't be, "Is this true?" The first question would be, "Where did you get this?" Marisol had no answer to that question. She didn't know who had placed the envelope in her locker. She couldn't prove that she hadn't created it herself. 4 years earlier, at a major hospital in this city, she had learned that when a person with power had to choose between believing an uncomfortable truth and believing that the person carrying that truth had an agenda of their own, they almost always chose the second, because the second choice didn't require them to change anything at all. And if Raphael chose that way, what she would lose wouldn't be her job. What she would lose was Nadia. Nadia would lose this person that very night. And 6 months later, once the ink on the signature had dried, she would lose the other one too. Marisol got up and paced the narrow room until nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. Then she carried the 2 sheets into the kitchen, placed them in the small steel basin she used for washing vegetables, and set them on fire. She watched them burn completely. The flames passed over the bold printed name at the top of the page, over the payment date, over the first 2 initials of a name. She opened the window to let the smoke out, washed the basin clean, and put it back where it belonged. She felt as though she had aged years in a single night, measured by the way nights like that seemed to measure a person's age, and she understood perfectly well what she had just done. With her own hands, she had destroyed the only thing that might have saved Nadia in a single evening, and she had done it because she knew it would most likely save no one at all, but only push everything faster toward the exact ending someone had already paid a 3-month deposit to secure. If she couldn't prove what she knew, then the only thing left for her to do was make sure no one could use her as the excuse. She sat down at the table, took out a blank sheet of paper, and wrote, She kept it short, exactly 6 lines, without a single word of resentment. She wrote that she was resigning, that she would complete the required notice period according to policy, that she would fully hand over all monitoring records and professional notes to her successor, and that she recommended the replacement be arranged at least 2 weeks in advance, so there would be time to become familiar with Nadia. There was no reason given. There wasn't a single sentence mentioning anyone. The next morning, she arrived 40 minutes earlier than usual. Everyone in the house was still asleep. She went upstairs to the 2nd floor, stopped outside the door to Rafael Santoro's study, bent down, and slid the folded sheet of paper beneath the door. Then she continued toward the end of the hallway, placed a blank sheet of drawing paper and a new pencil outside Nadia's door, just as she had done every morning throughout the past week, and went downstairs to the kitchen to begin her shift. Rafael found the sheet at 7:20 in the morning, when he opened the study door and stepped on it. He picked it up, unfolded it, read all 6 lines in about 10 seconds, then read it a second time much more slowly. 3 days earlier, at Sunday dinner, Priscilla had mentioned that the engagement celebration should be held in the middle of December, before everyone left for the holidays, and he had said he would check his schedule. He carried the paper down to the kitchen. Marisol was standing at the sink with her sleeves rolled up, and she heard his footsteps but didn't turn around. He placed the sheet on the stone counter, right beside where she was standing. He said, "You're planning to leave this under my door and disappear after my engagement party." Marisol turned off the faucet, dried her hands, and only then turned to face him. She said, "I'm planning to complete my notice period, make a full handover, and leave without ruining anyone's evening." He asked why. She said, "The reason matters less than my following proper procedure." He said, "Don't speak to me in that tone." Marisol was silent for a few seconds. Then she said, "Mr. Santoro, you're about to stand in front of 40 people and declare another woman your wife. I didn't realize my leaving needed your permission before it could mean anything." Raphael stood there with both hands braced against the stone counter, and in that exact moment, he understood something he had spent 4 months refusing to understand, that the anger he was feeling wasn't the anger of a man losing a good employee, but he didn't say it aloud. He folded the paper, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and said, "I haven't approved it." Then he walked away. 3 days later, on Sunday afternoon, Marisol went to the nursing home in Chelsea as she always did, and stopped at the administrative desk to make the payment for the new month. The employee checked the computer, then said, "Miss Vega, your father's account has already been paid." Marisol asked, "Paid through when?" The woman looked at the screen and said, "Through the end." Marisol asked, "What do you mean by the end?" The woman said, "I mean all of it, ma'am. The entire outstanding balance and all future costs. A trust has been established in your father's name, and the funds were transferred last week." Marisol stood at the desk for a long time. She asked who had transferred the money. The employee said the sender had requested that the information remain confidential. Marisol asked whether it was a company on State Street. The woman fell silent, and that silence was the answer. On Monday morning, Marisol arrived early and asked to see him. She placed an envelope on his desk containing every dollar in her savings account, everything she had managed to save over 4 years, and she said, "I know it isn't enough. I'll repay the rest over time. Please give me a statement of the amount." Raphael looked at the envelope. He didn't reach for it. He asked, "What do you think I did that for?" She said, "I don't think anything. I simply won't accept it." He stood, walked around the desk, and said very slowly that you stayed through the night of the power outage. You sat for 2 hours and 40 minutes in an art gallery, so my sister wouldn't have to explain to herself that she didn't matter. You spent 4 nights sewing something I had locked inside a box for 3 years because I didn't have the courage to open it. He said, "I'm not buying you, Miss Vega. I'm paying for the nights you didn't sleep." Marisol didn't answer immediately. When she finally could, her voice was slightly rough, and she said, "Then thank you." Then she continued, "But my last day is still the 19th. Raphael turned away. Without looking at her, he asked, "Have you ever stopped to ask whether leaving might hurt someone?" Marisol picked up the envelope of money, put it back into her bag, and said, "Yes, sir. I ask myself every night." Then she left the room. That afternoon, Rosalind Santoro sent for her in the east sitting room. She was seated in the chair she had used for 30 years, one hand resting on her cane, and she pointed to the chair across from her and told Marisol to sit down. Marisol said, "Thank you, ma'am. I can stand." Rosalind said, "I can't properly question a woman when she's standing there like a piece of furniture in my house." Marisol sat down. The older woman studied her for a long time, then asked directly, without any attempt to soften it, "Do you have feelings for my grandson?" The only sound in the room was the clock. Marisol didn't lower her eyes, and she didn't answer immediately either. Then she said, "Ma'am, what I feel doesn't give me the right to interfere with his decisions." Rosalind tapped the head of her cane once against the carpet. She said, "That's not an answer." Marisol said, "It's the only answer I'm allowed to give inside this house." The older woman fell silent. Then she asked, "Why are you leaving, then?" Marisol said, "Because for the past several weeks I've been asking myself whether I'm staying because of Nadia or because of something else. And I'm no longer certain of the answer." She said, "A nurse who is no longer certain of her own motives has to leave before they begin affecting the patient." Rosalind looked at her for a very long time after that. She said, "You know, I opposed you from the first day." Marisol said, "I know, ma'am." Rosalind asked whether she was angry about it. She said, "No, you were protecting your family. You simply chose the wrong threat." Rosalind didn't say anything else. She told her to go back to work. But when Marisol had reached the doorway, she called her back and asked one final question. "If someone gave you something that could prove you were right, what would you do with it?" Marisol stopped in the doorway. She said, "I would ask myself who benefits if I bring it forward. And if the answer isn't Nadia, then I wouldn't." Then she walked out. Rosalind Santoro remained sitting alone in that room for a very long time, both hands folded over the top of her cane. And no one knew what she was thinking. On December 19th, 2 hours before the guests arrived, Nadia sat on the floor of her room and said she was afraid she might forget. Marisol was folding clothes, and she stopped and asked what she was afraid of forgetting. Nadia said that tonight she wanted to tell Raphael something, but the last time she tried, the words wouldn't line up properly, so he told her she had heard it wrong. Marisol sat down on the floor beside her. She took a sheet of drawing paper, tore it in half, and said, "Then we'll write it down." Nadia said she didn't know how to write it. Marisol said, "I'll ask, you answer, and you're only allowed to say what you truly heard. You can't add anything." They sat together for 30 minutes. In the end, there were exactly 3 sentences on the paper, written in Nadia's large, rounded handwriting. The first sentence was about the afternoon of her birthday, outside on the porch, when someone had been talking on the phone. The second was about June, about paperwork, about how he would sign. The third contained only a name, the name Nadia had spelled over and over 4 times, until she was certain she had written the sound exactly as she remembered hearing it. Marisol folded the paper into quarters and told her to put it in her coat pocket, the left pocket, the one with the button. Then she stayed beside her and gave her 3 instructions. She said, "Tell the truth, only the truth, and don't add that you don't like her, because that's not the truth that needs to be told tonight." She said, "Don't let your anger carry it for you, because if you're angry, people will only hear the anger, and they won't hear what you're saying." Then she gave the 3rd instruction. "Once you've said it, stop." Nadia asked, "What if he still doesn't believe me?" Marisol said, "Then you will still have told the truth, and sometimes the truth needs more time before a person's pride allows it to come inside." 40 minutes before the guests arrived, Priscilla entered Nadia's room. She complimented the gray sweater with the blue collar, straightened one fold for her, and said there would be a lot of people tonight, so she didn't need to say very much. Then she took a small sheet of paper from her pocket, folded into quarters, exactly the same size, folded in exactly the same way. She handed it to Nadia and said, "I wrote this for you already. Just read this. All right, it's shorter and easier for you." Nadia opened it. There was only 1 line on the page. "I'm happy for you." Priscilla stroked Nadia's hair, said, "I'll go downstairs first," then left the room. No one saw her hand touch the left coat pocket with the button. There was no camera covering that corner of the room, and Nadia was holding the new piece of paper in her hand, reading those 4 short words over and over, so she didn't notice. By 8 o'clock, when she was standing in the great living room among 40 people, and when her brother rose to raise his glass, she reached into the left pocket of her coat. There was only 1 sheet of paper inside. She didn't need it anymore. She had spelled that name 4 times that afternoon, and there are some things a person remembers not with memory, but with some other place inside them. While the entire room had fallen silent, and the woman standing beside her was holding a smile on her face, Nadia took a step back, looked up at her brother, and said in a voice clear enough for the last table to hear, "No, I want Mari." Raphael went still and told her this was not the place, but Nadia didn't back down. Priscilla said quickly that the girl was confused, but Nadia looked directly at her and said, Because you're only kind to me when Raphael is watching. Mari is kind to me on the nights when nobody is. I heard you talking about Ashwood Grove. You said June. You said he would sign. You said the place was far away. But that was better. Then she stopped. Exactly as she had been told. Somewhere behind them, a glass touched the surface of a table. Priscilla laughed, a very soft laugh, and she said, "Sweetheart, you've misunderstood something again." But Raphael Santoro wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his sister. And there wasn't a single thought in his mind about whether he believed her or not. There was only one thing in his mind, cold and clear as the point of a knife. She couldn't have invented that name. A person who hadn't read newspapers for 3 years, didn't use a phone, and didn't leave the grounds of the house except for 2 therapy sessions each week, couldn't invent the name of a residential facility in Vermont, couldn't connect it to June, and couldn't connect it to a signature. He set his glass down on the table. He apologized to the guests and said the evening would end here, that he would contact each of them later. Priscilla grabbed his arm and said, "You can't do this to me because of something that girl said." Raphael removed her hand, not roughly, and said very quietly, "I'm not stopping because my sister said something. I'm stopping because my sister knows something. She has no possible way of knowing." The guests left over the next 40 minutes. By close to 11 o'clock, only the people of the household remained, and Raphael went looking for Marisol. He found her in the ground floor hallway, already wearing her coat, with a cloth bag resting at her feet. He asked where she was going. She said, "Today is the 19th, sir. I handed over the records and my notes to the replacement this afternoon." He said, "I just stopped the engagement." Marisol said, "I know. I was standing in the corner of the room." He said, "Then stay." And she looked at him, longer than she had ever looked at him in 4 months, then said the words he would carry with him through that entire winter. "You just stopped yourself from making a mistake, Mr. Santoro. That isn't the same thing as choosing me." He said, "Give me time." She said, "I've given you 4 months, and for those 4 months I've been standing in a place where a woman shouldn't stand, inside your house but outside your decision." She said, "I won't stand there for one more night." Then she added, her voice softening, "Don't tell Nadia I'm leaving because of what happened tonight. She'll think it's her fault." He asked, "Then what am I supposed to tell her?" Marisol picked up her bag and said, "Tell her Mari will come visit her, and then you have to make sure those words are true." She walked toward the door. At the top of the staircase, Nadia stood watching her leave, one hand gripping the blue collar of her sweater, and she didn't call out even once, because that afternoon she had learned that once you had said what needed to be said, you had to stop. On the morning of December 20th, Raphael Santoro summoned Tobias Mercer before 7 o'clock and placed on the desk the same file Tobias had given him back in September, the file Raphael had said would never change his mind. He said only one sentence: "Start over, and this time, don't stop wherever things look clean." Tobias needed 4 days. The first thing he found was the simplest thing, and also the thing that had hidden everything else: the name. In every professional record, every business document, every article about the gallery on Newberry Street, the woman used her mother's surname. Hale was her mother's name. Her father's surname was different, and that name had once appeared on the brass plaque of a law firm on Federal Street, a firm that had dissolved 3 years earlier, whose founder had removed his name from the professional registry that same year. The second thing Tobias found was buried in the old appointment records Raphael's office, still kept according to policy. On that Thursday afternoon 3 years earlier, the meeting Raphael had been forced to move was with 3 attorneys from that firm, and the request to reschedule hadn't come from Raphael. It had come from their side at 10:40 that morning, with the explanation that a client matter required immediate attention. The name signed at the bottom of the rescheduling letter belonged to Priscilla Hale's father. If the meeting had taken place at its original time, Raphael would have been sitting in his own car early that afternoon. The man had moved it 6 hours later. The third thing Tobias discovered made him sit in silence for 10 minutes before he could continue. 6 weeks after the accident, that law firm received an out-of-court settlement involving another client, the largest fee in the firm's history, paid by a group of companies whose true ownership Tobias knew very well. Then the firm dissolved. People don't buy silence by telling someone to keep quiet. They buy it by paying enough that speaking becomes a loss. Tobias found the fourth thing on the final day, and he found it because he searched the names of every former client the law firm had represented. On that list was a name connected to an incident at a major Boston hospital 4 years earlier, a case that ended in an internal settlement, never reached a courtroom, and never appeared in the press. And in the related personnel records, under the night shift nursing staff for that evening, was the name of a 23-year-old woman named Marisol Vega. Tobias printed everything, 3 complete sets, and on the afternoon of December 24th, he went to retrieve the originals from the corporate records office on Cambridge Street. When he came out of the building, it was already dark, and the parking lot was nearly empty. 3 men were waiting near the exit. The man in the middle said, "Mr. Mercer, you're getting old. Some things are better left alone." Tobias said, "I'm 50. I'm not that old yet." The other man reached for the briefcase in his hand. There was a short struggle. The briefcase fell onto the concrete. Tobias's glasses flew off, and he was shoved back against the side of his car. Then a car door closed somewhere behind them. Rafael Santoro walked toward them with both hands in the pockets of his coat, unhurried. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch anyone. He stopped 2 steps away from the 3 men, bent down, picked up Tobias's glasses, brushed the dust from them, then said only one sentence, and he said it in the quietest voice. The voice everyone who had worked for him long enough knew was the most dangerous one. He said, "You're standing on my property, working for a law firm that no longer exists, and I'm a woman, very interested in knowing who is still paying you." The 3 men looked at one another. The man in the middle let go of the briefcase. They stepped back, turned away, and none of them said another word. Tobias gathered the files from the ground, put his glasses back on, and said, "You got here sooner than I expected." Raphael said, "I got here 3 years too late." The following evening, Priscilla Hale came to the Marblehead house by invitation, and there was no one in the study except the 2 of them. Raphael didn't ask her to sit. He placed 3 things on the desk in order: the rescheduling letter signed by her father, the record of the settlement fee, and the date the law firm dissolved, and a copy of the receipt for a 3-month deposit at a facility in Vermont, something Tobias had obtained directly from the facility that morning. He didn't speak loudly. He asked her, "When did you know?" Priscilla looked at the 3 sheets of paper, and the most frightening thing was that she didn't turn pale at all. She only let out a very soft breath, like someone finally setting down a heavy bag she had been carrying for too long. She said, "I knew before I met you." She said, "My father didn't kill your mother. You know that, don't you?" Raphael said he knew something was going to happen, and he moved a meeting. Priscilla said he wasn't certain. No one was certain, and afterward he paid for it with his entire career. Raphael asked, "Then what did you come into this house to do?" She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I came to take back what my family lost, and I calculated that it would take 6 months." He asked, "And Nadia?" Priscilla said, "I never intended to hurt the girl. I only meant to move her somewhere she could receive better care, somewhere with doctors, gardens, a room for painting." Raphael said, "You meant to remove my sister from her own home." She lifted her eyes to him, and for the first time in 4 months, her voice was no longer gentle. She said, "Do you really think I'm the only person who wanted that girl out of this house?" Then she picked up her bag and walked out. She didn't cry, didn't beg, and didn't look back once. Raphael remained standing in the study for a long time after the sound of her car disappeared beyond the gates, because that final sentence was lying on his desk like a shard of broken glass, and he still didn't know where he could touch it without cutting himself. 3 days later, on the afternoon of December 28th, Rosalind Santoro arrived at her grandson's house without warning, sat down in the chair she had occupied for 30 years, and said there was something she needed to tell him before the old year ended. She said the envelope placed in Miss Vega's locker near the end of November had been put there on her orders. Raphael turned sharply toward her. He asked, "How long have you known?" She said she had become suspicious in October, when that color-coded schedule appeared, and she had arranged for someone to investigate in her own way. He asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" Rosalind said, "Because you would have thought I was interfering again, the way I've interfered for 30 years, and you would have defended her simply to prove that you didn't need me." She said, "So I gave it to the person you would believe." Raphael said, "She never gave it to me." The old woman struck the head of her cane once against the carpet, and she said very slowly, "I know. I waited 3 weeks and nothing happened. Then I had someone ask again, and found out that she burned it the same night she received it." Then she said the words Raphael would remember for the rest of his life. "I handed her a knife, and she burned it." From the moment I learned that, I understood that for 30 years, I've been choosing the wrong kind of woman for the men in this family. On the first day of January, Nadia brought the recipe notebook down to the kitchen and sat flipping through it for her brother. And when she reached the place where the page had been torn out, she said exactly what she had told Marisol one afternoon in September. Mother hid that. This time, Raphael didn't let it pass. He asked where Mother had hidden it. Nadia shrugged. He asked again whether she remembered when Mother had hidden it. She said when Mother was cleaning the room, she took the picture down. Raphael stood, went up to the 3rd floor, entered the room he had kept locked for 3 years, and took the wedding photograph down from the wall. He removed the backing. Tucked between the cardboard backing and the back of the photograph was a sheet of paper folded into quarters, its edge jagged, exactly the edge Marisol had once run her finger across. There was no recipe written on it. There was an address, the name of a care center in the state of Maine, a telephone number, and beneath those things was a single handwritten sentence in slanted blue ink, Teresa Santoro's handwriting, saying only this: "If anything happens to Mother, don't let anyone take you far away from your brother." Raphael sat on the floor of that sealed room for a very long time with the paper in his hand. There was no one's name on it. There was no accusation. His mother hadn't known what was coming, and hadn't known who was involved. She had only had a mother's instinct, and she had written it down and hidden it in a place only her daughter would see, because there are fears people don't dare speak aloud, but can't bear to carry away with them either. He folded the paper again and slipped it into the notebook, exactly where it had once been torn out. That winter, the house in Marblehead began learning the smallest things all over again. Raphael learned how to tie hair, and during the first 2 weeks the results were so terrible that Nadia had to sit in front of the mirror, watch him do it, then take it apart and redo it herself. He learned to make almond cakes from the notebook, and the first batch burned along one edge. And when Nadia pointed at the burned part, he repeated the exact words he had once heard from the top of the stairs on a September afternoon. "It's not burned. It just spent a little too much time feeling confident." Nadia laughed, then said, "That line belongs to Mari." He said, "I know." He stopped leaving it to the chauffeur to take his sister to therapy. On Tuesdays and Fridays, he drove her himself, sat waiting in the row of chairs outside, and didn't bring his phone inside. One afternoon on the way home, Nadia looked out through the window and said, "You give me a lot of things, but Mari gives me time." Raphael couldn't find a single answer, and he kept driving until they had reached the end of the coastal road. The community clinic in Somerville occupied the ground floor of an old building, and every Thursday afternoon, the activity room in the back was used for a recovery group for young people living with the aftermath of trauma. Raphael came on a February afternoon and stood outside the glass door waiting for the session to end, and he watched that woman sitting on the floor in the middle of a circle of 7 or 8 young people, not lecturing, spending most of the time simply sitting quietly. When everyone had gone, he stepped inside. He didn't bring flowers. He didn't bring a ring. He brought a rolled sheet of drawing paper, opened it across the table, and there was the picture of 3 people standing in front of a window, overlooking the sea, the picture he had pried out of the locked drawer at the foot of the staircase with his own hands. He said, "I didn't come here to ask you to come back to work." Marisol said then, "What did you come here for?" He said, "I came to ask you to have dinner with me, and I'll listen to every condition you have before you answer." She sat down, and she gave him 4. First, she would never work for him again in any capacity. Second, she would keep her profession and keep this job, no matter what happened. Third, she wouldn't move into that house simply because Nadia missed her, and if there ever came a day when she walked into that house to stay, it would have to be for another reason. Fourth, Nadia would never be used as a messenger between the two of them, because that girl had already carried far too much for adults over the past 3 years. Raphael said, "I agree to all 4. Marisol said, "There's one more thing." Then she took from her bag the yellowed envelope she had kept in the bottom drawer for the past several months and placed it on the table. She said, "Before you sit down to eat with me, you have to read this." He opened it. Half a page, 3 clean paragraphs, and at the top was the embossed letterhead of a company on State Street. He read very slowly. Then he asked the child's name. Marisol said, "Diego, my little brother. 9 years old. His surgery was scheduled for March 19th, and this arrived 11 days before that." Raphael placed the paper on the table. He didn't say, "I was only 24 then." He didn't say the person who signed this retired a long time ago. He didn't say a single word to separate himself from the name printed at the top of the page. He said, "The name on that letter is my family's name. I won't explain it away. I will repay it." 3 weeks later, the community clinic in Somerville received the legal documents establishing a fund to support heart surgery for children, with enough initial capital to pay for 14 surgeries each year, with no time limit, no family name attached to it, no plaque in the lobby, no press release. In the documents, the fund was called the Diego Vega Fund. Marisol read the copy at her desk, and she had to step outside and stand in the hallway for quite a long time before she could come back in. Dinner happened on Saturday evening at a small restaurant 2 blocks from the clinic, and Nadia didn't come with them, exactly as required by the 4th condition. But she did send something. Inside the small box Raphael placed on the table was their mother's thin silver bracelet. He said, "This isn't a proposal. Don't misunderstand me." He said, "Nadia told me to say that Mari should keep this for me, and when I'm older, I'll ask for it back." Marisol picked up the bracelet and said, "I can't wear this. It belonged to her mother." Raphael said she guessed you'd say that, so she told me to repeat one sentence exactly. He said, "You aren't taking Mother's place. You're standing in the place where Mother couldn't stay." Marisol couldn't say anything for a long time. She put the bracelet around her wrist. Then she looked up and said, "I'm paying for this dinner. Don't argue with me." He said, "Then I'll pay next time." She said, "We'll deal with next time when it comes." And that was everything the two of them promised each other that evening. Nothing more, because they had both learned that grand promises are easy to make and difficult to keep, while one more dinner the following week is something a person can actually keep. This story doesn't end with a wedding, and perhaps it doesn't need to. It ends with something much simpler: that a person's dignity has never lived in the uniform they wear, or in the name engraved on the brass plaque outside their gate. It lives in where they choose to stand, when no one is watching. The person who truly belongs to a family isn't the one who looks best in the photograph. It's the one who stays through the nights when the power goes out. The one who sits for 2 hours and 40 minutes in a room where nearly all the lights have been turned off. The one who places a blank sheet of paper outside a door for 3 mornings in a row without asking a single question. And there is one more thing this story leaves behind: that when someone more vulnerable finally speaks the truth, even if they stumble over the words, even if the words refuse to line up properly, the responsibility of the stronger person is to listen first, not rush to explain why they themselves are right, because sometimes the truth has already been spoken to us, and we're simply smiling and resting a hand on the speaker's shoulder, never realizing that we've just let it slip past us. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video with the people you think may need to hear it too, so that each day we can have one more kind and meaningful story to listen to together. How did this story make you feel? Which character did you relate to most? And in your own life, have you ever met someone who stayed with you through the nights when no one was watching? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish every one of you watching this video strong health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.